So, you've been working on a game for a while, and you've got it to a pretty good state. The game is playable, it's fun, and your playtesters enjoy it, but you know something isn't quite right. In this video, I want to go over 5 common game design problems that you might have with your prototype, and some ways that you can fix them. Hi, I'm Matthew Dunstan. I'm a full-time board game designer based in Australia, and to date I've had over 60 games published all around the world. On this channel, I like to talk about all things game design, from my journey in the industry to tips and tricks that can help you on your own game design journey. Just as there's no one way to go about designing a game, there's no one way to fix a problem in a game design of yours. And so this video is intended to be a toolbox of sorts that you can turn to when you have a problem, and you might find the right tool or solution in that toolbox that can help you remedy that solution and make an even better game. Problem number 1. So I've got a great mechanism, but I don't really know where to go from here. I think a very common way for newer designers to start designing games is that they have an idea for an amazing mechanism or interaction that they want to have in a game, and they start building a game around that key mechanism. It might be something like worker placement or drafting, and at the start they're focused on using that mechanism to its fullest potential. Unfortunately, what happens with this approach is often you get to some midway point where you have a pretty well-functioning game, and that mechanism that you wanted in the game is functioning well, it's enjoyable, it's presenting perhaps an interesting puzzle for players. But then you get a bit stuck, because the mechanism by itself doesn't really suggest a lot of other things in the game. What are the players doing? Who are the players in the game? What's the theme or setting of the game? How do players win? All of these questions aren't really solved by a mechanism. You need to come up with a host of other ideas that you're going to pair with that original mechanism to give a completed game. And so you can get a bit stuck sometimes not knowing what the next step is. If I have a mechanical or gameplay based idea for my game, I try to pair it with a strong theme or setting from the very start. And you can do that with your game by thinking about a theme or setting that you can now pair with that strong mechanism that you have already in your game. The benefits of having a strong theme or setting is that it starts to help you answer a lot of those other questions I talked about in where to go next with your design. It might suggest who the players are in the game, what they're actually doing, maybe what the resources that you're using. You can give them definite names and give them character that makes sense. It can suggest what the victory conditions are or what players need to do to earn points. And the stronger a theme, the richer and more immersive it is, you'll find more interesting and unique answers to all these different questions. And the best themes will result in a game that could only occur with that particular theme or setting, and that wouldn't make sense in any other theme. And the added benefit of introducing it as early as you can in the game design process means that the game design side of things can grow at the same time as the theme, so they can integrate well with each other and speak to each other in a really intertwined and meaningful way. And I think those are the strongest games that get made, those which have really strong ties between mechanics and theme. Another thing you do is look at other games which use a similar mechanism and see what they do to answer these other design questions. And there's nothing wrong with using a similar answer to what those games did, for instance. So for example, if you have a resource management game and you see other games that present players with contracts that they need to hand in resources to gain those contracts and gain points, it's fine to try and use that in your game. Of course, you might want to try and think of a bit of a twist on that formula, but it's a great way to get started and actually look to implement something new in your game by looking at what else has already been done. And the last tip, I think, for this is to think of some interesting constraints that might help you restrict the types of answers you can make to those different questions about where to take your game next. For instance, maybe you've been working on a drafting game, but what happens if that drafting game could only have 18 cards? That would immediately set restrictions on what types of victory conditions you can have, how players are going to get points, what players can do on their turn. It suddenly starts to help you answer all these other questions in a meaningful way. So a component restriction like the one I said, or maybe a player count restriction, or even a complexity restriction. If you really want your game to be played by families, for instance, that will rule out certain more complex things that the players will be doing on their turn. All of these things can help you move forward and move the game out of that rut of just being a mechanism to being a fully fledged game. Problem number 2. There's too much downtime in the game, and players get bored between their turns. This is a pretty common problem, and it can be hard to diagnose sometimes during playtesting because it's hard to know exactly how much of the game is lagging just because the game isn't finished and it might be a bit rough, and how much it has to do with the actual design of the game. But more and more, that's a thing that players find quite negative about experience if they feel like they're checking out when it's not their turn and they're not immersed in the game on every player's turn. But thankfully, there are a lot of interesting ways that you can help deal with downtime, or at least alleviate its problems for players. The first and maybe the most obvious solution is to have simultaneous play in your game. If the players are all playing their turns at the same time, then there's virtually no downtime. And in a way, I think this is one of the things behind the popularity of roll and write games or flip and fill games, of which I've designed quite a few, because players are acting at the same time as each other. They react to a common die result or card flip, and then use that result on their own piece of paper. So there's virtually no downtime, players are always immersed in that puzzle, and it can be really rewarding. Of course, simultaneous play will suit certain types of games over others. For example, it's a bit hard potentially to have a simultaneous worker placement game, although it's not impossible. And so use this solution sparingly or thoughtfully in games that make sense for it. Another tip, or rather something to look out for, are parts of a game that elongate a single player's turn more than it needs to be, which of course leads to downtime for all the other players. And one problem that I think is relatively easy to fix is presenting a player with too much new information at the start of their turn. One way that makes players' turns quicker is if they can plan for those turns. While it's not their turn, they can think about what they're going to do on their next turn, and then when it comes to their next turn, well, they can just take that action quite quickly. But the thing that kills this planning or makes it very difficult is if you present players with a lot of new information at the immediate start of their turn, then they have to process all that new information on their turn. They can't process it at other times when other players are taking their turns. And one place where you see it a lot is where players are drawing cards from a deck, and they draw those cards at the start of their turn. And so every card they draw at the start, that's a new piece of information that they have to look at, think about, and then consider how it impacts what they were thinking about doing on their turn. And a really easy way that you can fix this problem is to simply move that drawing of a card, or multiple cards, to the end of a player's turn, rather than at the start. Because then if they draw the cards at the end of the turn, then they have the whole way around the table while other players take their turn to consider those new cards and reformulate a new plan. And another way that you can think about lessening the feeling of downtime for a player during a game is to give them more things to think about during other players' turns. Because downtime isn't really about a player not acting. It's not the players really want to be taking decisions through the whole game. In fact, that might be quite tiring if you were taking decisions for a whole hour. But rather it's this feeling of checking out. It's this feeling of, well, I don't really care what's going on other players' turns, and there's nothing useful that I can be thinking about that makes it worth my time, and so I check out of the game mentally, and I disconnect from it. If there's a way that you can keep players connected with the game, immersed in it during other players' turns, and then that will also hopefully eliminate that feeling of downtime for a player. There's a couple of main ways you can think about this. There can be a very direct way where players will gain benefits on other players' turns on the basis of their actions. For instance, in the worker placement game Kalis, players can effectively own locations on the board, and when players place one of their workers on that location, if another player owns it, then they get a benefit at the same time on that other player's turn. And so players are often engaged in other people's turns because they want to see whether their building is going to be activated and they'll get some benefit from it. And that's a very direct way to deal with that immersion problem. But another easy way to think about it is, how can I make other players' actions influence what I can do as a player on my next turn? I think a really great example of this is Azul, and the way that tiles flow through Azul. In Azul you have a certain number of factories, these circular tiles in the center of the table, and each of them has a certain number of tiles on them. And over the course of the game, some tiles will also be in the center. And on your turn you're going to take one type of tile from either one of the factory tiles or the center of the table. The important thing is, when you take tiles from a factory tile, all the tiles that you didn't take, that weren't of the type you took, they get moved into the center. And that one movement creates new opportunities, new choices for players that are going to go after you. Of course, the tiles that are in the center of the table have changed, and so if players were thinking about taking tiles from the center, they might rethink that decision. Or you might have taken tiles from the factory tile that they wanted to take from. And so they're engaged on your turn because they're trying to work out, are you going to take what they really want? Are they going to have to rethink their plans? And this really simple connection between your action as a player and its impact on the other players helps reduce that feeling of downtime. It increases the immersion of other players in the game at all times. Problem number 3. My players are simply overwhelmed. As you get to designing more complex games, it can feel that players are just overwhelmed by the number of choices they have on their turn. Their turns get longer and longer, the game slows to a halt, and you lose any sense of flow or enjoyment. I think generally the tendency when you're starting design is to add a lot of things to a game, especially to solve problems. And that can lead to a lot of rules, a lot of components, a lot of things to be thinking about on your turn. And that can only exacerbate that feeling of being overwhelmed. And while it might be pretty common, I think there are some good ways to try and help reduce this feeling of overwhelm for players. The first thing, going back to what I just said before, when you're thinking about solving a problem in your game, think about solving it by removing something rather than adding something. Every time you add new components or rules to the game, that's a new thing that players have to comprehend while they're going to play it, and that's simply going to make the game longer and harder to learn. And while it can be tempting to fix problems by adding something because you can add something that's perfectly poised to fix a particular problem, if you instead step back and think, well, what can I remove from the game? Or maybe what two elements can I merge into one thing? Then not only are you going to be fixing the problem that you set out to fix, you're also going to be reducing the overall rules overhead and complexity of the game, which will make it run more smoothly and be easier for players to play. It doesn't always work. Sometimes you really do have to add something to fix a particular problem in a game. But at least if you try to remove something first, on average you'll keep the complexity in check. Another very direct way you can think about reducing the feeling of overwhelm for players is simply to reduce the number of options or actions that they're going to take on their turn. For example, you might have designed your game to have a set number of phases that a player will go through on their turn, maybe 3, 4 or 5 phases, and these steps they have to take in order and do all of them on their turn before it's the next player's turn. If players only have to go through 2 steps on their turn instead of 5, that's going to be much easier for them to pass all the different options they have and to take a quicker turn and not feel overwhelmed. Or think about getting rid of phases altogether in your game and simply have players take one action on their turn, maybe chosen from a set of 2 or 3 different options. Another thing that can often lead to overwhelm for players is how much players have to track in a game in order to make their decisions. How many different elements or components that they have to be observing and thinking about to try and make a decision. And one of the biggest offenders of this is having to look at what other players are doing in a very detailed way. Imagine a tableau building game, for instance, where players are playing cards in front of them, and each of those cards has a certain power or effect for that player. If on my turn, I have to not only consider what I have on cards in front of me, but I also have to consider all the cards in front of all the other players, then that's going to be a huge cognitive burden on me to try and figure out how all these cards work together and to try and make a choice from all of that. So be really careful when you add any mechanisms or things in your game which force players to really understand what other players can do on their tableau, to have to count icons that might be in front of other players. Because every time you're asking a player to do that, you're asking them to do more work. It's more things they have to do, especially if you're looking at another player's area from across the table. It might even actually just be harder to see what's in front of that other player because it's a little bit further away. Be really careful when you introduce that requirement to look at what other players are doing. It can be very useful because it keeps players interacting with each other and concerned about what they're doing, but used too much and it can just simply be too overwhelming. Another reason players can feel overwhelmed is that they can feel that the results of their actions are somewhat unknown when they take those actions. And so it's really hard for them to make a decision because there isn't something that will definitely result from their action. For example, if you're asking players to roll some dice and then the results of the dice determines what the action actually does, it can add a cognitive burden on players as they try and work out all the probabilities before they roll the dice, before they decide what they do on their turn, because they have to try and filter through this randomness, this unknown result of their actions. Another type of mechanism that can have this sometimes is things like area control or various spatial puzzles, where players are required to make a decision early on, but they don't really know how the board might turn out. They don't know where other agents might be placed or how many agents will be placed in the same area. And if you're not careful, this can feel very overwhelming because players have to make a choice without enough information to help them make that choice. And some players don't do well by acting by gut feeling, and they feel like they want to be able to compute the results of their action. But if you make that too hard, or the result of randomness, or the result of other actions too far ahead in the game, that can lead players to feeling overwhelmed. And so shortening the distance between a player's action and the reward or the feedback of that action can help reduce the feeling of overwhelm and can help players accurately predict what's going to happen when they take different actions in the game. And a last tip around this that can be similar to that is to try and employ both short-term and long-term goals in your game. Especially short-term goals help players a lot in making decisions on their turn. They might not have a grand strategy for the whole game or fully comprehend all the options that are available to them, but if they have a strong, clear short-term goal that they can understand, that can help them narrow down from a lot of different options of the game to decide on that one choice or one action that they're going to take that's going to get them closer to that short-term goal. Problem number 4. There's not enough interaction between players in the game. This is perhaps one of the most talked about topics, I think, in game design, and often it's brought up by publishers when they criticize prototypes for not having enough player interaction and feeling too much like multiplayer solitaire. And so there is a lot of thought about how to introduce interaction into a game and how to fix it. And I have a couple of thoughts about this. The first is that actually it might not be a problem. As much as the term multiplayer solitaire is used pejoratively in the industry a lot to denigrate a game because it's low interaction, there are a whole bunch of players who actually really like playing these styles of games. And so not having interaction is only a problem if it's needed in the style of game you're making. If you're deliberately making a game with low amounts of interaction, then that's fine. Don't feel like it's a problem that you absolutely have to fix. In fact, the worst thing to do sometimes is to introduce interaction into a game where it just doesn't make any sense. We've all played games with random take that mechanics in the middle of an otherwise very peaceful game, where suddenly you're forcing another player to discard a card or destroying one of their buildings out of nowhere, where most of the other game is you just building up your own tableau. So interaction has to be meaningfully used in games where it makes sense, and don't feel the pressure to introduce it into your game where it doesn't fit. The second idea around interaction is think about how the single actions a player takes on their turn not only affects their outcome in the game, but also affects the choices and decisions other players are going to make on their turn. A classic example of this is worker placement, where I take a choice where to place my worker on the board and take an action on my turn, and where I place it can't be taken by other players on future turns. So the result of my action is I get something positive where I place my worker, but I've also taken away a choice for other players. And therefore, it's quite interactive. I can in fact place my worker that maybe doesn't benefit me that much, but really prevents you from doing something very powerful for yourself. And that's all wrapped up in one mechanism. It doesn't feel tacked on, it feels natural, and there's only one set of rules around how that mechanism works. You don't need this additional interaction mechanic. And so thinking about features of your game that can be naturally interactive, drafting, worker placement, and then you can just think about ways of heightening the feeling of interaction around these mechanisms. How do you make it really important to other players as to what worker placement spot is taken by me on your turn? How do you raise the stakes around that? As you heighten that feeling of loss when somebody takes the worker space you want, that's going to naturally make the game feel more interactive. One other thing to think about fixing this problem of interaction is potentially introducing positive interaction into your game. I think when we think of interaction, we naturally think of negative interaction very often because we're playing competitive games, and the way that you interact with your opponents is trying to beat them, trying to be better than them, trying to take things away from them. But that doesn't have to be the case. There are many great instances of ways of positively interacting with each other that you can think about implementing in your game. One such idea is around trading. If you think about all the way back to Settlers of Catan, where you're trading resources between one another, often a way to win Catan is to just simply do more trades than the other players. Because every time you trade with another player, while often you'll be giving an advantage to the player you traded with as well, both you and that other player are getting a relative advantage over all the other players who didn't participate in the trade. And so over the course of the game, if you're involved in more trades, then you'll get more advantages over the other players. This is a very legitimate source of interaction in your game, and it might make a lot more sense than the more traditional negative forms of interaction that we think about in game design. And problem number 5, my game is just mid. I'm not sure how the kids say it now, but basically your game is just a bit middle of the road. This is perhaps one of the hardest and most common problems that crops up in game design, and definitely crops up in my own games. You start working on a game and it flows pretty well, and you get to a point where it's playable and enjoyable, and there's no obvious problems, but you get to the end of that and it's a 6 out of 10 game. It works fine, but it's not particularly memorable, and you don't think it necessarily stands a very good chance of being signed by a publisher. What are some ways that you can take that game and maybe move it out of the mid category to something a little bit more exceptional? Focusing on trying to excel at one element for your game to be excellent at least one thing can be a great way to focus your efforts to improving that one thing to get the game out of its medium state. It doesn't have to excel at absolutely everything. In fact, games can't, otherwise they'd be a mess. And the types of things I think about excelling at: does your game excel at speed or flow? Does your game exceed at moments? Or does your game excel being a puzzle? This list is exhaustive, but these 3 things can help a game really stand out in a player's mind and give them the best experience. By excelling at speed or flow, what I mean is a game which doesn't overstay its welcome, which keeps players really engaged throughout the whole time, and where the different mechanisms and actions in the game flow one into the other in a really natural and intuitive way. This is often a lot easier to do when the game is shorter and has fewer elements and actions, and that can be a call to make your game simpler or remove elements to improve that speed or flow that players feel like as they're playing the game. I think of games like Point Salad, which are so minimal in terms of what a player can do on their turn. They're either taking 2 fruit or vegetable cards, or they're taking a contract, that's it. But because it's so minimal, the turns just flow so quickly. It's take. And a game, even with 6 players, takes 10 or 15 minutes. And not only do you get so much enjoyment packed into a really small amount of time, that speed element, but also the flow as the game moves around the table is just really enjoyable. You feel really engaged even when it's not other people's turn, and you get to the end not exhausted, but exhilarated at what you just experienced. By excelling at moments, it's really about how can you create really memorable moments in your game that stand out and players will reflect back on long after they've played the game. Hidden Trader games are a great example of this. The rest of the game might not be particularly exceptional, but it can be those few moments where a trader manages to betray everyone or a trader is revealed to everyone. Those can really stand out amongst all the rest of the game. And so if you have a really good base of a game that works really well, think about, are there certain key moments in the game that you can really enhance, that you can raise the stakes for, that you can make them so important and so suspenseful, so that no matter what happens at that moment, players are going to remember what happened. And the last thing is your game excelling at being a puzzle. There's a certain style of player that just loves a great puzzle. They love the cerebral challenge of trying to figure out how to make different parts fit together in an interesting and powerful way, and sitting down again and again and again to that same puzzle, and suddenly the pieces are in different places and you have to solve that problem again. And so if your game is already tending towards that way, being a bit of a puzzle, see if you again can enhance that, can excel at that feeling of puzzle. How do you give that puzzle depth? How do you give it variety? How do you make players feel really smart by coming up with the best way to solve a particular problem on their turn? And how can you present that puzzle in a fresh way, in an interesting way, for every player's turn? For me, in one of my own designs that is a great example of this is Monumental, which, while it's a big game with lots of different elements, troops on a map and a big board and lots of cards, at the heart of it is just a really good puzzle. Players have a 3x3 grid of cards in front of them, and on their turn they select all the cards in one row and one column that they're going to use on their turn, and those cards get activated. And the cards in a player's grid change every turn, so every turn they're presented with a fresh take on this puzzle that they have to solve in their own little way to do the best that they can on their turn. And that's what players think is exceptional, and what they remember about that game. And for me, leaning into that in the design of Monumental was what helped it stand out in the market. And another solution, if you think your game is just a bit medium, is just to not work on it for a little while. Sometimes the best thing you can do at that stage is actually put the game on a shelf or on the back burner and just leave it for a while. You'll be surprised at how much your mind will keep working on the game in your subconscious without you really thinking about it. And then one day you'll be walking along and you'll have the idea that we'll fix the game or we'll make it so much better than what it was already. Maybe you would never have come to that realization if you had tried to force it, if you'd sat at your desk banging your head against the table, trying to come up with a way to improve the game. Sometimes improvements in a game design are not linear or predictable. They need time for your brain to work on them. The worst thing you do is try and force improvements on a game when you don't have a clear way of making it better or a clear idea. And the last tip about feeling like your game is a bit mid and that's a bit of a problem is to really think about who you're playtesting it with. Sometimes the people you've got playtesting your game are simply not the intended audience for the game. And if you're playtesting with players who aren't in that intended audience, then they might think it's just okay because it's not exactly the type of game they really enjoy. But if you were to play it with the intended audience, they might really love the game. It might be doing exactly what they want. And until you play it with those types of players as your playtesters, then you won't know that. It can be quite difficult to distinguish between a game which is just okay or a game which is just being played with maybe not the best audience. And so that's why it's so important to playtest with such a wide variety of players, especially if you're not exactly sure who your game might be for, if it's in the earlier stages. And if you do know who your game is for, to make sure you playtest it with those people. So those were some thoughts and suggestions about how to fix common problems with game designs. Take what fits for you and discard the rest. There's no one way to design games, there's no one way to fix problems in game designs. These are just suggestions. If you've got any good suggestions for ways to fix common problems in your games, maybe you've come across them in your own designs and you found a particular solution that worked really well and that might work for other players, please leave them down in the comments below. As always, I love that this channel can be a community where we help each other improve our game designs. But until next time, thanks very much for watching and all the best with your game design. Bye.